Welcome to GRE. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. If you don't take the right action, inflation will make you poorer. Then the affordable housing crisis keeps your tenant as your tenant. Is zoning what's ruining American cities and keeping starter homes unaffordable or just plain extinct in some areas? How do we get more apartments and more density built? Today on Get Rich Education. When you want the best real estate and finance info, the modern internet experience limits your free articles access, and it's replete with paywalls, and you've got pop-ups and push notifications and cookies disclaimers. Ugh. At no other time in history has it been more vital to place nice, clean, free content into your hands that actually adds no hype value to your life. See, this is the golden age of quality newsletters, and I write every word of ours myself. It's got a dash of humor, and it's to the point. To get the letter, it couldn't be more simple. Text GRE to 66866, and when you start the free newsletter, you'll also get my 1-hour fast real estate course completely free. It's called the Don't Quit Your Daydream Letter, and it wires your mind for wealth. Make sure you read it. Text GRE to 66866. Text GRE to 66866.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to GRE, from Calgary, Alberta to Tirana, Albania, and across 188 nations worldwide. I'm Keith Weinhold, and you are listening to Get Rich Education. When most investors think about inflation, they get it mostly wrong. Their strategy is inflation hedging. And you know, even if you successfully hedge inflation, you are really missing out. You've really got to get fired up about beating inflation. When did you get your first job, like your first real job in your life? Let's say you did that when you were age 18. Well, that work that you did when you were 18, that created value for somebody else. And you could have done anything with your valuable youth. But instead, you chose to provide value by focusing your time and your energy to sweep floors or enter data into a spreadsheet for somebody else. You were paid for that work that you did. You were paid in dollars. Well, if you just tried to store your finite energy that you expended for that employer into dollars, you will lose. Your value will be coerced away from you by your government that just incessantly and relentlessly debases the dollar that you earned at age 18 because they just keep printing more of them. Well, that money printer, which creates the inflation, is then an extraction of your resources. Yeah, they extracted your resources of your time, energy, and ingenuity away from you when you were 18. And even the work that you do today, its value will get extracted away from you too if you, say, store dollars under your mattress. If you instead invest it so that its growth rate keeps up with inflation, well, then all you've done is hedge inflation. My point is, get upset about how the system extracts resources from you. And my other point is, don't hedge. Hedge just means that you're treading water. Position yourself to win instead, because you can. When you buy income-producing property with a loan, you don't just hedge against inflation, you win 3 ways at the same time. You probably know that's called the inflation triple crown, a concept that I coined. You can watch the 3-part video series on that free. It's now easier than ever to access. Learn how to actually profit from inflation, not just hedge yourself against it. You can watch that, and it's friction-free. There's no email address to leave or anything. Simply watch, learn, and maybe even be amazed at how you can do this. Those 3 videos are available at getricheducation.com/inflation triple crown. That's sort of long, so you can also get there with getricheducation.com/ITC. Again, that's getricheducation.com/ITC. Before we talk with our guest about how zoning is making the affordable housing crisis even worse, housing values and rents are really looking stable in today's environment. CoreLogic tells us that single-family rents are up 3.2% annually. That's the highest rate in a year. And when it comes to prices, the NAR tells us that existing single-family home prices hit a record high of $426,900. And that is an all-time high. And note that that's existing homes, not new. So median existing homes are basically $427K now. And what does that really mean? Well, that is up 4.1% year over year. The real estate market continues to be, it's sort of this tale of the equity rich versus the affordability challenged. Are you equity rich or are you affordability challenged? Well, the more property that you own, the more equity rich you are feeling and that you're going to feel. And oftentimes you're renting out property to the affordably challenged. Of course, the big buzz and a potential really turning point in the economy here or not, it really began about 10 days ago. That's when America reported weak jobs numbers, and that sent the unemployment rate from 4.1% up to 4.3%. Citigroup and JP Morgan are now predicting half-point Fed rate cuts in both September and November, not just quarter-point cuts anymore. I mean, gosh, if there's one thing that we really know, it's that nobody really knows anything. Starting about 2 years ago, everyone thought a recession was imminent. Bloomberg even said there was a 100% chance that we'd have one by last year. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Everyone thought there would be 6 or 7 Fed rate cuts this year. Wrong, wrong, wrong. You can't even completely count on a rate cut at the next meeting. I mean, sheesh. Before that time, we still have 2 new CPI reports to come out and another jobs report. So, over the long term, this is just how people act. They tend to get ahead of themselves and overreact. And that's really more of a stock market investor sort of thing. And yeah, despite the volatility, us real estate investors are here more chill than Snoop Dogg was at the Olympics. Well, all this fear, what it does is it pushes money into bonds. And when money goes into bonds, it makes mortgage rates go down. And they recently hit 16-month lows near 6.4%. And if rates stay low, millions of additional Americans will be able to qualify to buy property that couldn't before, and that could really put more upward pressure on property prices, more than this 4.1% year-over-year appreciation that we're currently seeing. We know that lots of investors are buying properties like you, getting equity rich and serving the affordability challenge. In fact, 60% of home builders indicated that they sold homes to investors from February through April, while 40% reported that they didn't sell to investors. And investors now represent wholly 25% of both new and resale residential transactions. And among builders that sold to investors in the past 90 days, 69% of them sold to mom and pop investors. Mom and pop investors, they're loosely defined as those that own 1 to 10 rental units. They may very well be you. Institutional investors, those that own 10 plus investment properties in this home builder's definition here, well, those institutional investors, they accounted for just 4% of investor sales nationally. So again, more home builders are selling to small real estate investors, those that own 1 to 10 units. Well, now, in almost 10 years of doing the show here, we've never had a full discussion about zoning. And really, this is the time. Okay, this ends today because we describe how it's contributing to the affordable housing crisis and what we can do about it. I mean, anymore, you really can't find a brand new build 250K starter home anymore, unless maybe it's a tiny home, which then really isn't a full home, and you sacrifice your lifestyle. Well, zoning is a big reason why. The Supreme Court decision that deemed zoning constitutional, that occurred in 1926. Yeah, so that's going to turn 100 in the year 2026. That Supreme Court decision, that infamously referred to apartments as parasites. Wow. But yet, is some zoning good? I mean, say that you and your family have your nice, quiet, single-family home on an idyllic half-acre lot. Well, if that's the case, should it be allowed that Bitcoin mining facility with its loud cooling fans is built right next to you? I'll ask our guest expert about that. And what about, say, less offensive transgressions, like a condo board that says that you can't rent your unit out? How much zoning is too much or too little? I mean, is someone just being overly sensitive if a duplex is built next to their single-family home and they complain about that? So we'll get into all of that, and it really comes down to limiting this McMansionization risk type of NIMBYism, not in my backyardism. That's what it is. Again, you can watch the 3 free videos on how you can substantially and actionably profit from inflation, not hedge, but profit from inflation. It's the Inflation Triple Crown. Be sure to check out those 3 videos at getricheducation.com/ITC. I learned about this week's guest through Reason.com. We met in person at last month's Freedom Fest in Las Vegas. He is the research director for California YIMBY. Yes, YIMBY, not NIMBY. That is, yes, in my backyard. And he's a professional city planner. He's the author of the book Arbitrary Lines, How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It. Welcome to GRE, Nolan Gray.
Thanks so much, Keith. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Nolan, you wrote one article for Reason.com with such an interesting title, 5 words, Abolish Zoning, All of It. You're pretty emphatic there on what you'd like to have happen. Before we discuss that, why don't you tell us, in your words, what zoning is?
So for the past 100 years, America's cities have been running a grand experiment in how they're governed. Essentially what we've done, beginning in the 1920s, is we said for every single parcel in the city, we're going to assign an allowed use. So most people, if you've played SimCity, you know this might be residential, commercial, industrial, but it goes into so much more detail than that. Different types of residential might be allowed in different parts of the city, commercial, etc. In the vast majority of most American cities, the only form of residential that's allowed is a detached single-family home.
Right.
So that's one half of it. The second half of what zoning is doing, it's placing arbitrary density limits. So the amount of actual housing or amount of floor area that you can build on any particular lot. And it's important to distinguish this from other forms of land use regulation because in many cases, these rules aren't actually based on any health or safety concerns, but instead a sort of social project of engineering what a correct city should look like. And as I argue in the book, and we can discuss over the course of this conversation, is I argue that these rules have actually had incredible harms for our cities and are at the root of our current housing affordability crisis.
I think zoning, initially, it began in New York City about 100 years ago.
Yeah, so New York City adopted one of the first modern zoning ordinances in 1916. A handful of other cities did so as well. So I'm coming to you from California. Berkeley, California also adopted zoning in this year. And essentially what happened after New York City adopted it was the federal government put together what's called the Standard Zoning Enabling Act. They mailed that out to every single state in the country and started putting a lot of pressure on states to adopt zoning and allow local governments to adopt zoning. And then with the rise of the federal financial system as part of the New Deal housing programs, in many cases, local governments were required or strongly incentivized to adopt zoning codes to be eligible for certain federal benefits.
You know, maybe philosophically, one might think, Nolan, well, America stands for freedom, and I should get to do what I want with my plot of land. But if everyone can do whatever they want with their plot of land, I mean, does that mean that my neighbor then could start a sloppy hog farm? Or the neighbor on the other side of me could start a battery factory with smokestacks? So do those sort of things help make the case for zoning?
Yeah, that's a great question. So before the rise of zoning, we actually had a lot of rules for these classic nuisances, these classic externalities, things like smoke, smells, noise, or even just lots and lots of traffic generation. And we had rules to say, hey, if you want to operate certain types of uses, you need to be in a certain designated area where we're going to tolerate a much higher level of externalities. Zoning does that, but it also does so much more. And it's those other aspects that I think are ill-conceived. So, for example, of course, we don't want a slaughterhouse next to a single-family home, but zoning might also say, oh, by the way, you're not allowed to have a duplex next to a single-family home. You're not allowed to start a home-based business. You're not allowed to operate certain commercial uses out of certain strip malls in certain parts of the city. You're not allowed to build anything unless you have a certain number of off-street parking spaces, which can make adaptive reuse of historic properties very difficult. So I think absolutely there's a core of land use regulation that makes sense, that's focused on neighbors not imposing costs on each other. But our current system goes so much further than that, in many ways imposes new and unconceived costs, including increasing housing prices, limiting housing options in many of our neighborhoods, making it harder to start a business or to have neighborhoods serving retail in many of our neighborhoods.
Yeah, so perhaps zoning has just simply gone too far. And you touched on it earlier. It seems to me that about 3/4 of the area of most cities have zoning restricted only to single-family home building, for example, and they ban apartments completely. So maybe as we try to find the right balance of how much zoning is right, tell us more about really the thesis of your book and why we should ban zoning completely.
Of course, we need certain regulations for externalities and nuisances, and to a certain extent that can be resolved through litigation. But ideally, you look forward and you say, okay, look, there are certain areas where we're going to tolerate certain nuisances and other places where we will not. But beyond that, I think so much of what our land use regulations do is actually causing harm. It's preventing property owners from using their property in ways that are not in any meaningful sense harmful to their neighbors. It's created this context where now, if you want to build just about anything in the typical American city, you have to go through multiple public hearings. You have to do an environmental report in some states. You have to get the permission of local elected officials. You have to undertake all these actions that heavily politicize every new development. And so what we get is so many of our neighborhoods and so many of our cities are locked in amber. And this is partly why, over the last few years where we've seen a huge amount of demand flow into housing, we've simply had these extreme shortages because markets could not respond with the supply that many of our communities needed. So, for example, a starter home in many U.S. cities today might be a townhouse. It might be a 2-bedroom condo. It might be a single-family home on a 2,500 square foot lot. But those are precisely the forms of housing that in many cases our zoning codes make illegal to build. So we're essentially saying if you can't afford at least a certain level of housing, you're not allowed to live in many parts of the community, if in the community altogether. Or the same with businesses. If you want to start a small business that might not necessarily have any impact on your neighbors, you might require a special permit. You might require a hearing. You might require to attend a hearing where your competitors are going to show up and oppose your project purely on a cynical basis. So what it's done is it's created this incredibly disruptive system that's prevented our cities from being entrepreneurial and adaptive. And I think this is the root of a lot of the problems that we're facing today.
Oh, you really surfaced some good points there, Nolan. When I think of overzoning, and we talk about how a lot of times you can't build anything more than a single-family home, that certainly creates a lot of problems. Gentrification is sort of a bad word, kind of sprucing up communities so much, raising the value so much, that one problem is that familial bonds decay when children that grew up in, say, Southern California can no longer afford to live there, so they have to move to lower-cost Las Vegas, a 4 to 5 hour drive away. Excessive gentrification, you touched on it, it also harms mobility. If you want to move from Atlanta to Boston for a tech job, but you can't find housing, you're not going to move there, so therefore talent doesn't get messed up with opportunity.
That's exactly right. I mean, this is at the national scale, this is an important piece of the puzzle, which is we've made it hardest to actually move to some of our most productive places. So as you mentioned, places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Boston, New York City, for all their problems, these are incredibly productive places where folks can move to and get high-paying jobs and other good educational opportunities. But in many cases, these are the most expensive cities in our country. And it's in no small part because of the many rules and regulations that make it so hard to build housing in those contexts. So you're exactly right. Folks actually turn down higher paying jobs or better opportunities and move to places simply because the housing is more affordable. And you pick up on a really important piece of this, which is in many cases, this is breaking apart families. So a lot of folks who are born and raised in a place like California, their parents might have been able to buy their home in the 70s or 80s or 90s, but they can't afford a home. They have no long-term path to actually staying in the community. And so what you're actually seeing is neighborhoods and communities being ripped apart. The situation in a place like California has actually gotten to be so bad that many of the people who are, in a certain sense, beneficiaries of the status quo, maybe they own their home and they're seeing the value go up and up and up. They're also saying, oh, my children can't afford to live near me. I don't ever get to see my grandkids. The person who serves me at the hospital or at the supermarket can't afford to live here, and we're having trouble keeping folks on. The crisis has got to be so bad in certain places like California that we're starting to see tremors of reform. But one of the things I like to say is, if you want to fall into a California-style housing crisis, most parts of the country don't need to do anything. The rules you have on the books have you moving in that trajectory.
Right.
But if you want to remain a place where we can build more housing, where folks can buy their own home or buy small apartment buildings and start to build wealth, you have to allow for more supply to come online.
Sure. Zoning so that you can't build anything other than single-family homes compounds the affordability crisis. There really just isn't any such thing as a $250K starter home anymore, anywhere. You represent California YIMBY, and you live there in the state where people think of ground zero for excessive regulation and taxation and zoning too. I do read more about some zoning being relaxed in California, allowing for the building of an ADU on a property, for example, to help build the density. But before you talk about some of the cracks that are actually starting to help break this down, can you give any bad examples that are especially problematic there in your home state, Nolan?
For the past 50 or 60 years, California has been stuck under a NIMBY paradigm, not in my backyard, right? Every single new project is politically contentious, has to undertake an environmental report, it has to undergo multiple public reviews. It takes years and years to get a permit, and that's if the housing's legal to build at all. As you know, in so many parts of California, there's very little to no new construction happening, and that's because of the rules on the books that make it so hard to build. To the extent that we allow new housing to be built, we have a whole bunch of mandates that force the housing to be a lot more expensive, and even if all that pencils, again, it can take 2 years to get fully entitled and a permit. And so, of course, the only housing that actually ends up getting built is quite expensive. And some folks say, well, if we allow new housing to be built in California, it's all expensive. Well, yes, if you only allow a trickle of new housing in a very expensive context, of course the new housing is going to be expensive. But if you look to places like Texas and Florida, for example, that build lots and lots of new housing and don't have all of these costly mandates, they actually can build a lot of new housing and actually can keep prices relatively under control and create that new supply of what we call missing middle, low-rise housing. So as you mentioned, the tide, I think, is turning in California. The silver lining of things getting so bad is that the culture is shifting. And what we've seen is the emergence of this new YIMBY movement, or yes in my backyard. And these are folks who are saying, hey, not only is not building more not this horrible threat to my community, but it's actually this enriching opportunity. It's good to have a growing, healthy, affordable community where folks are building, folks are able to move to high opportunity jobs, and folks are able to have choice in the neighborhood they live in.
We're talking about zoning and how that's made the affordable housing crisis worse in the United States with California YIMBY's Nolan Gray. Nolan, tell us more about just the exact sorts of codes that are problematic. We touched on apartment building bans, but I think we're also looking at things like off-street parking requirements. You need to have so many off-street parking spaces before you can build, otherwise you can't build. Or you need to have a minimum lot size of a half acre or a quarter acre in order to build here. So can you talk more specifically about just some of those exact problems on a tactical level that are compounding here?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So where the housing is illegal to build altogether, in many cases, there are a whole bunch of rules that increase the price of that housing. So in urban context, for example, where you might want to be building apartments, in many cases, you might have parking requirements that say, well, you have to have 2 parking spaces per unit or 1 parking space per bedroom. In many cases, that's what consumers might demand, and you would have to build that to lease out those units or to sell those condos. But if you're building in a context where you might be near a transit line, or you might be near a university campus, or you might be near a major job center, many of your renters might say, hey, actually, I would prefer to have a more affordable rental or a more affordable condo, because we know that there's no such thing as free parking. You know, if it requires a structure or excavation work, parking can easily add $50,000 to the price of a new unit. And so some consumers might want to pay for that, eat that cost, have a parking space. But many consumers, when we relax these rules and say, hey, developers, you have the incentives and the local knowledge needed to decide how much parking to build, in many cases, we find that they share parking with other uses, so commercial during the day and residential at night, or they allow renters to opt into parking and to pay for parking. But what you get for many households is a cheaper unit. Now, another rule that you mentioned, which is very important, is minimum lot size rules. This is certainly a lot more relevant in suburban and rural context. But what we say is, if you want to be able to have a single family home, you have to be able to afford at least a certain amount of land. Now, when you have a context where you don't have water and sewer installed and you're operating on septic and well water, you do need larger lots as a matter of public health. But in most suburban contexts, these rules essentially serve no function except to increase the price of housing. And the ability to determine what type of housing can be built where is the ability to determine who gets to live where. So if we say, well, you're not allowed to live in this neighborhood unless you can afford a 10,000 square foot lot or a 20,000 square foot lot, what we're essentially doing in 2024, where land is a major factor in affordability, is we're saying that a whole bunch of middle working class households are not allowed to live in these neighborhoods, or they're not allowed to ever become homeowners and start building wealth in the same way that past generations did. And you look at places like Houston, for example, where they don't have zoning, but they have a lot of zoning-like rules. In 1998, they reduced their minimum lot sizes from 5,000 square feet citywide to 1,400 square feet citywide. And what this did was this kicked off a townhouse and small lot single-family home building boom that has helped to keep cities like Houston affordable. A whole new supply of starter homes that, again, offered that first step on the ladder of homeownership and wealth building.
Over the decades, home prices have outpaced incomes. There are a few reasons for that. One of them is inflation, with wages not keeping up with the real rate of inflation, but the other are barriers to development. We're talking more about that with Nolan Gray when we come back. You're listening to Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Hey, you can get your mortgage loans at the same place where I get mine, at Ridge Lending Group, NMLS 42056. They've provided our listeners with more loans than any provider in the entire nation because they specialize in income properties. They help you build a long-term plan for growing your real estate empire with leverage. You can start your pre-qualification and chat with President Chaley Ridge personally. Start now while it's on your mind at ridgelendinggroup.com. That's ridgelendinggroup.com. Your bank is getting rich off of you. The national average bank account pays less than 1% on your savings. If your money isn't making 4%, you're losing your hard-earned cash to inflation. Let the Liquidity Fund help you put your money to work with minimum risk. Your cash generates up to an 8% return with compound interest year in and year out instead of earning less than 1% sitting in your bank account. The minimum investment is just $25K. You keep getting paid until you decide you want your money back. Their decade-plus track record proves they've always paid their investors 100% in full and on time. And I would know because I'm an investor too. Earn 8%, hundreds of others are. Text FAMILY to 66866. Learn more about Freedom Family Investments Liquidity Fund on your journey to financial freedom through passive income. Text FAMILY to 66866.
This is Rich Dad, Poor Dad author Robert Kiyosaki. Listen to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold. And the reason I respect Keith, he's a very strong, smart, bright young man.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education. We're talking with California YIMBY's Nolan Gray about zoning and how these barriers to development are compounding the affordable housing crisis. And there sure are a number of barriers to multifamily production. I really think that's what a lot of it comes down to. You touched on it earlier, and it's something that I spoke about with our audience a month or two ago, Nolan, and that is MMM, multifamily's missing middle. These 2 to 4 unit properties, duplexes to fourplexes, where they're only constructing about 40% as many of those here in recent years than they did 20 to 30 years ago. The way I think of it is when you lift barriers to multifamily production, of course, you incentivize builders. If a developer buys an acre of land for, say, $90,000 and they had planned to build 1 unit on that, all right, well, there's one set of inputs and income that a developer can look at. But instead, if you allow them to go from building 1 unit on this plot of land to 2 units on it, it increases their profit potential and it incentivizes developers from that side as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so there's been some great work by some friends over at the American Enterprise Institute. What they've done is they've created a nationwide map of McMansionization risk. So when we have these conversations, we say, hey, let's allow for a range of housing typologies in more neighborhoods. You know, duplexes, triplexes, small, low-rise multifamily buildings, townhouses, the types of things that were commonly built in a range of neighborhoods before the rise of zoning. Every city in America has a neighborhood like this that's a mixture of housing typologies. It would be illegal to build that today, but in many cases, we subject it to preservation requirements because we value it so much that we want to keep it. In any case, what happens when you don't allow that type of gradual, incremental infill that keeps our communities affordable? What you get instead is the existing single-family homes are converted into much larger, much more expensive single-family homes. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with that. Many people might want to buy a smaller 1950s bungalow and turn it into a much larger 2,500 square foot single-family home, and God bless them if they want to do it. But what we have is rules on the books that say housing can only get more expensive. It can never get more affordable, or you can never unlock the wealth that's tied up in your land by building an ADU or by building a duplex or by creating more housing options for a range of households. And so that's really, really key. You know, the choice is not between do we want our communities to change or not. The question is, do we want our communities to remain affordable and maybe change and have some more buildings built and more growth and more development? Or do we want our communities to change in the sense of they become more expensive, folks retire and they move away, the neighborhood gradually becomes significantly more exclusionary, and young folks who grew up in the community can no longer afford to stay. That's the option facing many of our communities. And I think the YIMBY response to this is more housing construction is good and it's healthy and it's part of a thriving community.
Yeah, Nolan, when we come at this from the familial perspective, like I brought up earlier, it seems like the more zoning there is, the more it benefits seniors and incumbents, the more it benefits the silent generation, the baby boomer generation, and maybe Gen Xers, and it disadvantages millennials and Gen Zers that really don't have their place yet.
Yeah, you know, it's tough. I would say it even hurts seniors, right? I mean, if they want their young adult children to be able to live near them, or in many cases, seniors like the option to be able to build an accessory dwelling unit in their backyard, maybe rent that out to friends or family, or maybe even you move into the ADU and allow young adult children to move into the primary residence, or even just rent it out and have an additional source of income to supplement fixed incomes. There's reasons why folks, I think, at all different stages of their life benefit from more flexibility in the rules that govern what can be built.
Psychologically, how do we turn one's mindset from a NIMBY mindset to a YIMBY mindset? I mean, if someone's got their single-family ranch home that they want to live in their senior years and they want to see its value appreciate, so they don't want duplexes and fourplexes built next to them, rather than them saying no, to turn them into saying yes. I mean, how do you get those people to understand that, well, like, this is the way for the next generation for you to be able to live near your children and grandchildren?
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, I think when you go to these public hearings around projects, you hear relentlessly about the costs of new development, right? Folks speculating about traffic and runoff and other factors, parking. We get that perspective. We get bombarded with that perspective. But what we don't get is the alternative perspective of the benefits of a community remaining relatively affordable, remaining a place where teachers and nurses and firefighters can still afford to be able to own a home and live, allowing for the kids who grew up in a neighborhood or a city to remain there. And in fact, even just the selfish appeal to the homeowner, there's not actually any evidence that new development happening around you necessarily reduces the price of your single family home. And in some cases, it can actually signal to the market, hey, there's actually development potential on this. So when you do decide to maybe sell and move on, your land is potentially going to be more valuable because it has more development potential than it might under a strict exclusionary zoning scenario. So, you know, of course, you try to make the altruistic case to people, hey, think about future generations, think about folks who maybe want to move to this community or stay in this community, but aren't going to be able to if we don't build housing. But even so, I think there's selfish reasons. If you want to have somebody who's going to check you out at the supermarket or serve you at a restaurant or be a home care nurse eventually, you got to have housing for folks like that. In many cases, new development happening around you is going to increase your land value. You know, I would just try the range of appeals and work people through it. And in many cases, you know, I think people will understand, yeah, okay, I understand. We got to have some growth. They might have a perspective on what it should look like, and that's okay. But as long as we can get some consensus that we got to have some growth to accommodate demand, the form it takes, we can have a healthy discussion over.
Yeah, real community is the integration of all different types of people and not school teachers living an hour away where they need to make a 2-hour round trip drive every day. Well, Nolan, as we're winding down here, can you give us any more successful zoning reform examples that maybe other communities can look to? You touched on the success stories in Houston a bit. Are there some other ones?
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the most successful things we've done in California has been statewide legalization of accessory dwelling units.
Yeah.
That's been key. That started in 2017, and that took a lot of legislation to get us to a place where we are today. But that's resulted in something like 80,000 ADUs permitted since 2017. That's powerful stuff, right? That's 80,000 households that might have a home or might be able to rent out a unit to a young adult child or an aging parent. really, really powerful. So I would suggest that folks look into that. That's the lowest of the low-hanging fruit. Empower homeowners to add additional units to their properties. And by the way, we also allow ADUs to be added to multifamily properties, and we're seeing a lot of that happen as well. In other contexts, many cities, dozens of cities across the country have removed their minimum parking requirements, acknowledging that, hey, this is a huge cost that we're imposing on projects. Developers who are close to consumers, they have the incentives and the local knowledge to get this question right, let them decide. So that's been, I think, a big success. Certain cities like Austin and Minneapolis, for example, they've actually sort of kept their markets back under control amid all the chaos of the pandemic real estate market fluctuations by allowing for a lot more mid-rise multifamily on their commercial corridors and in job-rich areas and in places near transit. That's where we have a huge shortage, is these studios and one-bedrooms for young professionals who, if they can't find that unit, they're going to go bid up the price of a 2 or 3 bedroom unit. They're going to roommate up and be living in potentially overcrowded conditions. So Austin and Minneapolis, relative to peers, they built a lot of infill housing and have seen prices stabilize as a result. So there's a lot of different success stories. I would say if you're at all interested in this, talk to your neighbors about this issue. See what sorts of solutions might make sense for your community. In a suburban or a rural community, ADUs or minimum lot size reform might make sense. And an urban community, removing your parking mandates, allowing for more multifamily, allowing for missing middle might make more sense.
There sure are some encouraging signs there. Was there any last thing that a person should know, especially a real estate investor type audience that's interested in buying a property and running it out to a tenant for the production of income? Is there anything that our group really ought to know about zoning and the direction that things are moving, what to look for and what to be careful of?
Well, as your audience probably knows, that first essential step for your mom and pop local real estate investor is often a duplex, a triplex, a fourplex. Historically, that was an absolutely essential source of middle-class wealth building. Yeah. Right. And you can see these in so many historic neighborhoods. And to the extent that we've made those exact typologies so incredibly hard to build, we've cut off this very valuable source of democratic, decentralized wealth building that we need to actually encourage. As real estate investors and professionals, in many cases, you're an authority figure with your local policymakers and your local planners, and you can say to them, hey, here's my perspective on what's happening in the market. We have a shortage of a certain type of small-scale multifamily, or making this case. I talk to a lot of elected officials, and when I say starter home, I think they still think of the bungalow on the 5,000 square foot lot with the 2-car garage. But a starter home in 2024 might be a townhouse, 2-bedroom condo, a small lot single-family home. These are the types of stories that real estate investors and professionals are trusted advocates on, and you can make that case and explain to local policymakers, hey, here's the change that we need. Or explaining, hey, I wanted to add an additional unit to a property that I own, or I wanted to redevelop a property I own to add a lot more housing, and these were the barriers that I faced. That's incredibly valuable information for your local policymakers and planners. And I would say, look around. Many U.S. cities and states now have very active YIMBY or Yes in My Backyard groups. Go connect up with them. You could be a valuable, trusted expert for them, somebody that they can learn more about the situation with real estate markets, and they can be more effective advocates for policy that I think a lot of us would like to see.
And when it comes to changing NIMBY people to YIMBY people, and we look at aesthetics, an ADU in the back, that really doesn't change aesthetics on the street front. And I've seen very smart, careful designs of duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes that really look just like single-family homes from the street view level. So there really are some ways around this. You've given us some really good ideas today, Nolan. Hey, well, if someone wants to learn more about you and your work and zoning, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, I'm on the platform formerly known as Twitter. I'm at Nolan Gray, MNOLANGRAY. So feel free to find me there and reach out. And I have a book, Arbitrary Lines, How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It. Check that out if you're at all interested in this. Always reach out. I'd love to hear from folks. Thanks so much for having me, by the way.
All right. Well, I hope our audience didn't zone out. It's been great chatting with you, Nolan. Thanks so much for coming on to the show. Yeah, a thought-provoking discussion with California YIMBY's Nolan Gray there. It's essentially illegal to build affordable housing in a lot of areas with the way that these zoning laws are written, allowing for more dense building that can limit this ugly urban sprawl. And this makes me think about an Instagram account that I follow. It's called How Cars Ruined Our Cities, or some name similar to that. It shows, for example, a picture of how a highway interchange in sprawling Houston has an area so large that you could fit an entire Italian town inside of it. And these sprawl problems compound when a lot size must be, say, at least a quarter acre or a half acre. The tide is turning toward allowing more dense building in some places, like we touched on, but it's too bad that it took a visible housing crisis to make this happen. I mean, visible, like more homeless people out on the street. It took that almost for municipalities to start doing something about all of this. Our guest has quite a following on X. Again, you can find his handle there as Nolan Gray on X. And the image on his account cover, it shows someone holding up a sign that reads, "Zoning kills dreams." Big thanks to the terrific Nolan Gray today. Until next Monday, when I'll be back here to help you actionably build your real estate wealth, I'm Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.